rehearse or talk, and we'll see how that goes. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that Q&A, the ask me anything, ask us anything, is actually a good idea. Because after 26 years as a genealogist, one thing that's really brought home is just how local Ireland actually is, and how customs and traditions can actually change almost from parish to parish. So we are expecting to be cut out, but all the merrier for you guys. But in a sense, it's precisely that idea of just how local family history can be that brought me to this next talk. This talk again grew out of the course that I teach in Trinity College, Irish Family and Social History. We focus on the sources and the institutions that made the records. There's an archivist, and we use social history for context and interpretation. But as I've dug deeper into social history, I also found myself engaging with local history, what's actually happening on the ground. And I found myself engaging much more with folklore. Because I think that folklore allows me to get a more complete understanding of older customs and the traditions that shaped how people lived. The stories and oral histories of folklore often reveal the texture of everyday life, the life cycle events, community festivals, how people lived with the seasons. And nowadays, a lot of lifestyle writers in the newspapers talk about seasonality, but in fact, this is actually one of the oldest ways of living, of understanding the world around us, the natural world around us. And this is information that you don't easily find in the history books. Now, in this talk, we're going to look at the evidence in Ireland's National Folklore Collection. And then we're going to consider some case studies to show what evidence of family history can we find in the collection. The folklore collection is a record of Ireland's oral traditions and material culture. It consists of folklore collected from 32 counties in the English and the Irish languages. It's one of the largest archival holdings of its kind. It's been recognised by UNESCO for its significance in world culture. The archival collection includes 2 million manuscript pages, 500,000 index cards, about 12,000 hours of sound recordings, 80,000 photographs and counting, and more than 1,000 hours of video recordings. So these are some metrics, but they don't actually do it justice as to the richness of what's in the collection. It comprises some distinct collections. We have the main manuscript collection, the photographic collection, the schools collection is probably one that we're most familiar with, 1937 to 39. And the audio and video archives, the folk music archive, which I've really begun to engage with recently. I'm doing a lot on family history of travellers, and the folk music archive is one way into this. The Irish Surname Index, and I'm going to show you examples of all of these. But I want to first of all take a closer look at each collection to show you what is contained there. Okay, the main manuscript collection consists of over 2,500 bound volumes, more than 700,000 pages. Now these are verbatim transcripts of field recordings and collectors' diaries. The diaries have background information about the recording sessions, the informant, the person being interviewed, and what they did on any given day. Now this material was assembled after 1935 using a team of professionally trained collectors who worked full-time, and they went out into the regions. The collectors were very often chosen on the basis that they actually spoke not just Irish, but that they actually spoke with they had the local dialect and the local accent. The collection was created around key themes, things like community, themes of community and settlement, everyday life, livelihood and household support, trade and travel, popular beliefs, religious tradition, and folk medicine. These are just some, there's many, many more. And each of these themes was further broken down. So for example, the theme of community was broken down into kinship, and food, and clothing, and more. The collectors had to be familiar with the local dialect and the lore of the district. They didn't go in as empty vessels, and they could draw out the implications of what they heard. Now, in the early days, recognizing that the Irish language was in decline and the likely loss of tradition, collectors focused on recording what were called the language tradition bearers, the native Gaelic speakers in Ireland, but also the Scottish Hebrides and the Isle of Man. And this really opened my eyes. De Valera, when he actually realised the potential, and this is a time when money was not thick on the ground, De Valera okayed, he gave money to actually send the collectors into the Hebrides and the Isle of Man. So the folklore in the collection isn't really Irish, it is Celtic in the truest sense. Now the questionnaires are a subset of the main manuscript collection. In the 1940s, the folklore collection recognised some of the gaps in the material, and they began to enlist voluntary collectors. And they looked first and foremost to the local teachers. They sent out questionnaires on a wide range of questions, from holy wells to tally sticks, farriers to blacksmiths, thatching to matchmaking, and many, many more. The evidence in questionnaires tends to be more complete than the interviews. The volunteers who completed them considered the investigation subject in the round. But these prepared answers were also probably less rooted in the community, in the vernacular folk culture. And that raises the question, can we still consider these a primary source? I think so. They're an important contribution to the main manuscript collection. Now in this example on screen, you have an example of a questionnaire. This one concerns holy wells. The questions are very precise. Can you read question 6 there? And what purpose do people attend at the well? Volunteers were asked to distinguish between attendance for spiritual needs, to fulfill a vow, and to cure an ailment. Because what they're doing here is something really quite extraordinary. They're trying to track popular belief. How does folk belief actually endure? Now, the photographic collection includes more than 80,000 images of Irish folk life and performance, the people who were interviewed for their knowledge. The greater part of the collection starts from 1935 and it continues up to the early 21st century. But there's also some earlier images. There's glass placinaires and lantern slides dating back from the 1890s up to the 1930s. So even before the National Folklore Collection was actually put into, even before the commission was put into place, there already was a huge interest on the ground, and they were able to actually draw from this. And the collection has been augmented over the years by donations from the public. Folklife images are catalogued by date, by theme, and by title, and by place name. Usually also the name of the person who captured the image, or the person whose picture was taken, and the photographer's name too. These photographs document a much older way of life in Ireland that by the 1930s was already disappearing. The pictures provide the kind of incidental detail you don't easily find. And the incidental detail of every life we don't easily find in documents. And sometimes we don't even find it at all. This image on screen is a photo of a village dance at the end of a pier in Clogherhead, County Louth. Clogherhead is a farming and fishing community. Probably its most famous son or daughter is Éanna Ní Bhíonn. You'll hear on wildlife programs on RTE. Now, the couples here are set dancing to a 4-piece band at the end of the pier. If you look at this couple up front, we can only see 4 of the 6 women dancers clearly. But look at this, their dress length is midi, their hair is bobbed. Their style is in step with London fashions, contemporary London fashions. So even though they're living in a remote part of rural Ireland, they're keeping abreast of what's actually happening in a wider world. And it's much more difficult, of course, to say anything about men's fashions, because men's fashions tend to be much more stable or static, depending on what your position is. In this picture we see men harvesting seaweed. Seaweed has nitrogen, so it can be used as a fertilizer. And they've waded into the shallows, fully dressed, and carrying rakes and nets. Every community on the Irish coast would have harvested the seaweed. It was manual work. This is the kind of work done by subsistence level farmers. And it wasn't taxable, so it wasn't of interest to central or local government. They never make a record of it. And likewise, it fell below the radar of most literate people. But again, this is one of those things that's part of the texture of everyday life. And I will come back to this. I've got a great case study which shows the importance of gathering seaweed in the local community. Now, the collection is images of non-elite women working and at their leisure. And I can't impress upon you how important this is, because there's so few images of women images of women at this time. It's informative to actually find women in their own communities, even better to see them in their own homes. For most of the 20th century, official Ireland perceived women's place as being in the home. The domestic sphere was one of the most private, one of the least well documented areas. And so in these photographs, we quite literally get to look behind closed doors. We also find images of children at school, at work and at play. Among non-elite families, children helped out at home from a very young age, on the farm, in the workshop, or in the family business. Even the youngest child could wind wool or shoe the chickens out of the vegetable patch. As they got older, children and young people would take on much more physical work. In 1955, this lad had just drawn water from the well. He was returning home. As late as the 1950s, most houses in the Irish countryside didn't have running water or electricity. And so bringing water from the well to drink, to wash, to cook, to clean was a very important daily household task. There's long shadows here, so I think this is towards the end of the afternoon. And I can only imagine how heavy the barrel must have been. But I remember growing up as a child in the 70s and seeing barrels like this in the back garden of almost every house. We used them for bonfires. It never occurred to me that they might have been used, they might have been pushed to any other use before. My personal favourites are, among the folk life images, are of children at play. I love this one of two girls bobbing for apples. We know that this game was associated with Halloween. It was practiced in Ireland from at least the 18th century. That's the earliest reference we have to bobbing for apples. In De Valances, Collectania de Rebus Hibernicus. And I'm slaughtering rabbits, so please don't get my case for that. In Ireland, almost every child of every social background and every faith community played this. Possibly not the Plymouth Brethren, but just about everybody else. Now, we don't have many accounts of whether there were different versions of the game in different places, because it's part of folk culture. So it almost flies beneath the radar, what people think is important enough to document, to make a record of. Children also took part in religious observation, on festivals and saints' days. And each festival had its own customs. On Christmas Eve, the youngest child in the family lit a candle to place in the window. And this was something which I remember for the 4 years that I was still the youngest child in the family. I had the privilege of lighting that candle. And I can remember resenting my younger sister so much because she bumped me from that. So it's something that was actually passed down to the current generation. I've tried to pass it on to my kids. difficult to get them interested in anything that's not on the PlayStation or a tablet. The idea of the candle in the window was, of course, a signal to Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, and the little donkey. Even though there was no room at the inn, that they were welcome in that house. But it has been suggested, and in fact this custom dates back to the 18th century, to the penal times, and it may have originated as a way of signalling that the house was safe and the priest could enter to give the sacraments. Now in this picture, these children have gathered at St. Bridget's Well in Scanner, County Clare on the Saint's feast day, and they've made homemade St. Bridget's crosses. There were whole traditions about how families gathered on St. Bridget's Eve to eat a meal before. They wove the crosses from rushes and straw. And this is precisely the kind of activity that you won't find documented in the history books. But again, this comes back to that idea of being part of the fabric of everyday life. If you work with original letters or diaries, you'll sometimes find references to this and to other customs. And I always say to my own students to read widely, read as widely as you can, so that you can actually understand, when you're doing your own research, what is actually meant in a letter when they refer to something like this. Now the folklorists took pictures of the people that they interviewed. This is Mary Barlow of Letterbrone in County Sligo. The photograph was taken of her in 1935. Mary was born about 1855. She died in 1950, aged 95 years. So do you see what I've done by, we may not have a birth record for her, and I couldn't find a baptismal record for her, but I can deduce her approximate year of birth. So in a way I'm trying to establish clear parameters to begin to work up to try and track Mary. Now we get names and townland addresses and years. And in a sense, this is the holy grail of what we're always looking for in family history and local history. We're trying to pin down people to places at a given time. Now this family group is from left to right. Micheál O'Canada, his wife Eileen, she's staring down the barrel of the camera, and their daughter Nora. Look how well Nora is actually dressed. She's dressed very stylishly in a very contemporary way. The photos have an awful lot of incidental details that tell us how people lived. The O'Canada house is a traditional interior. It's quite plain. The walls have a plain line render. The family are all sitting around an open hearth with a wattle and broad canopy projecting out, which is decorated with shells. To the right of the canopy, you find a recess in the wall, inbuilt storage known as a thorlock. And again, these are things that you might find in a letter. Thank you for the money that you sent back. I put it in the tea caddy in the thorlock. And I am that idiot who has gone around for weeks wondering what in God's name does that mean, only to actually realise that it was there in front of me all the time. And the thorlock held things that had to be kept dry. In this instance, a tea caddy. Look and you'll see a cooking crane on the hearth. There's also a flag floor, and this would have been the main living room in the house. And if anyone wants to actually learn more about that, I have a huge draw for Claudia Kinman's book on traditional Irish furniture. It's beautifully written and beautifully illustrated as well. So you get a great sense of what it is that she's writing about and the development of folk furniture. Now we find photographs of the informants catalogued by date and place and names. And this gives us provenance for general stories, for accounts of how people lived. When we find specific stories about named individuals, we still have to weigh up the evidence. Now, I love this photograph here. This pair are sisters, Colch and Maura Russell of Dún Queen in Kerry. Now, at a glance, you would think they're two unassuming countrywomen. But the more I dug into the collection, I realised that, as a matter of fact, they were hardened media pros. Here they are, they've been interviewed on the Ediphone. This is an early recording device. The Ediphone was really cumbersome. It was heavy, the sound quality was poor. And when you hear old recordings, do you ever listen to Sunday in Assembly? Yeah. And you might hear that kind of muffled sound, and kind of crackle in the back. Well, those are recordings I'm on an Ediphone. And the sound is really crackly. But the Ediphone had the advantage of being a real icebreaker. And it was a talking point to get into the conversation. It was phased out in the mid-century. And the other problem with the Ediphone was that they used wax. And that in order to recycle them, they would scrape down, they would transcribe verbatim accounts, but then they would scrape out the wax and melt some more. So most of these original recordings don't, unfortunately, survive. But we do have the perfect transcript of the interviews that went with them. Now, this is Anna McAloon. She was born, bred, and died in the Bluestack Mountains in County Donegal. Now, Anna spoke only Irish. And so by the mid-20th century, monoglots in Irish were really quite rare. But monoglots in English were the norm. Some of the material in the National Folklore Collection is only available off Gaeilge. But there is an index of informants that people interviewed and of the districts. Now, the informants interviewed didn't just spill the beans on their own community. They often talked about earlier generations who lived in a particular farm or holding, who was evicted, who took assisted emigration from the landlord. A phrase that I hate, who took the soup. I just think that doesn't allow for the crushing reality, the poverty and the hunger that people faced at the time. I think it's a rational response. We also find evidence of the emigration charities. I always look for interviews. When I'm tracing a person of interest, I always look for interviews in the locale of the person that I'm tracing. Because even if I don't find a mention of the person or their family, their immediate family, it gives me an insight into the community about what was actually happening. The Irish Folklore Commission and its successors continue to collect material in every decade. In the 1950s, this is one of my favourite photographs. I love this. The Deasneys and the Cunnings in Ballincashel. So in the 50s, in the 60s, the 70s, 80s, 90s, right up until the 21st century. And this is 2002. This is the annual ceremony of the blessing of the boats in Belberg in County Mayo. Let's look at another part of the collection, the schools collection, which I think is the one that people are most familiar with. Completed between 1937 and 1939. Over 50,000 elementary school students in the 20 elementary. I'm sorry, I've actually said elementary rather than primary. I've given this before in the United States. So primary school students in the 26 counties of the Irish Free State took part. The children, supported by their teachers, collected folklore in their own homes, from parents and grandparents, neighbours and friends. And I think this idea of the support from the teachers is absolutely essential to the success of the project. The children were given simple instructions: go and find the oldest person in your family or the oldest person in your community who is willing to talk about former times. Now, the collection runs to more than 750,000 pages of material, including, I love riddles and sayings. I can actually go down a rabbit hole. I can start off researching this, looking for my person of interest, and suddenly get sidetracked by interesting words or phrases or sayings from the past that evoke something that will make me think of a phrase I may have used myself as a child. Games and pastimes. I love that for the same reason. And local stories. The schools collection survives, appropriately enough, in copybooks, bound copybooks. And every piece of folklore contributed includes the name of the teacher and the school by parish, barony and county. We also find the name of the child collecting the information and of the informant, the person that they interviewed. So this is the provenance of the stories you find. And we move forward now and start considering about weighing up evidence. On screen is one of the three pieces contributed in 1939 by Greta Colleen in Howth in County Dublin. Howth is now a suburb of Dublin. At the time, it would have been a fishing village, and slightly cut off, in fact, from the rest of the city. This one concerns cures for common ailments, including whooping cough and warts. I don't know about you, but when I was 8, this is the kind of thing that actually occupied us. In 2013, Greta Colleen, now Mrs. Greta Walsh, visited the National Folklore Commission, the National Folklore Collection, I should say, to read her own copywork. So she came full circle, 74 years later. And here she is with her daughters, Margaret Wilkinson, Pauline Day, and Kathleen O'Reilly, reading her own copywork. The audio and video collection has more than 12,000 hours of audio, 1,000 hours, would that it was 1,000 years, of video recordings. And again, these are made by professional fieldworkers. The earliest audio recordings in the collection are from 1897, and some of the material actually predates the Folklore Commission. 1897, that was the first kill in Belfast that year. But the majority of recordings date from the 1940s afterwards, precisely because the early Epiphone recordings were destroyed. The wax was scraped off so that they could be used again, they could be recycled. And the recorded interviews describe aspects of Irish folklore and history, ethnology, and also traditional music. Now, after 1950, the Epiphone was phased out by new technology, including reel-to-reel recorders. New technology produced better sound quality. It allowed collectors to continue talking for a much longer time and to permanently store recordings. And we have an almost complete record from the late 1940s onwards. The collection does have a bias towards the customs and traditions of the Irish countryside, but the Urban Folklore Project, set up in the late 70s, is a subset of the audio and video collection. This is a record of Dublin City's folklore and social history, made between October 1979 and December 1980. And this has over 700 interviews. The original audio recordings and transcripts survive. This photograph is of Shamrock Cellars in Dublin Henry Street in 1980. And I am going to ask, I see David Ryan in the audience, I'm going to ask David, and if there's anyone from Cork City and County Archive, because I was looking at the holdings and I saw that there are some transcripts of oral histories in the county and city archives, and I'd love to know more about that. Because again, it's this idea that local and family history is very much grounded in the communities that they come from. Now, recently I've been doing a bit of work with the Irish Folk Music Archive. This is recordings of singers and musicians. Its heyday was in the 40s and 50s when Seamus Ennis was himself a music collector. Now, Ennis was a musician and a folklorist. He was almost an Alan Lomax kind of figure. He went out into the communities and he recorded thousands of songs and airs and dance tunes. And I think so many musicians wanted to get an opportunity to actually play with Seamus Ennis. There's a more complete survival of music recordings because music was never taped over as the interviews were. Now, in addition to musical recordings, the Folk Music Archive has 3,000 pages of sheet music if you want to learn how to play. It has English language songbooks from the 18th and 19th century onwards, and a collection of 19th century broadsheet ballads. One of the reasons I've been working with it recently is that in the last decade, the National Folklore Collection has begun to, the traditional Irish traditional music archive. And so working with the National Folklore Collection and the ITNA, they've begun to focus on recording the musical traditions of travellers. And I was talking to a student recently who in tracing his family tree, suddenly realised that he was the great-grandson of Felix Doran, the great piper, the traveller piper from Wexford, the Wexford-Wicklow border. And that actually gives him what I call 7-league boots. It suddenly allows him to jump back, because we know that Felix Doran was the great-grandson of Johnny Cash. So suddenly it's actually possible to, using the music collections, to actually jump back another 4 generations. Something that there's no shortcuts in research. So we look to actually try and develop, we look sometimes to try and find this kind of connection where the familiar relationships are already established. Now, the Irish Surname Index is actually worth taking a quick look at. This developed out of the work of the Irish Folklore Commission. Collectors registered the names of the people they interviewed to capture the huge variation in these names between districts. And they made a surname head card for the surnames with varying forms, with one name taken as the advised, the master version. The surname head cards were used as a cross-referencing tool and to compile related versions under one surname. Now on screen I've used my own surname, Fitzsimon, as an example. And this includes variants, including Fitzsimmons with 2 M's, that's the form that's used most often in the UK and the US. But I also found new variants of my name. I'm in my 50s. Who'd have thunk it if you suddenly find a new form of your name? New to me at least. Ryder and McKnight, gaelicised as Mock and Ritter. Then we find the more common Simmons with a D without the Fitz and D at the end. And a gaelicised version of the name, O'Simon. The descendants of Simon harking back to the name's origins. The surname index is a work in progress, but sometimes if you pause and look at this, it allows you to suddenly realise, well, in fact, there's another maybe 15 or 20 interviews of people with this name from the district that could potentially be relevant to my research. And in family history, the evidence is so slight that, in a sense, we have to read everything. And we have to squeeze the sources, almost until the pipsqueak, to get every last piece of evidence from them. Okay, the National Folklore Collection is currently being digitised, starting with the earliest material from 1935. Now, as of November 2022, the greater part of the school's collection was online. There's hundreds of verbatim transcripts online, and there's over 12,000 photographs to sift through, but they really need to work on the online catalogue. Now you can search the online collection using a filter, search by the collection, and then search by the place to try and find stories for a specific district. The main collection also has an interactive map. You can search by people, you can look at stories and photographs concerning specific named individuals, the informants, the collectors, the photographers. Or you can search by themes. Whatever subject particularly interests you. And as a family historian, I tend to go for the hatch, match, and dispatch events of births, marriages, and deaths. But I also look to see when anybody might have got into trouble with the local authorities. By which I mean not simply the constabulary or justice of the peace, but also their landlord, and also the priest in an area. So I search by name, by townland, and by parish. Now, the collection has many uses for family and local historians. In the first instance, you understand what was intended by any custom. It can often help you to better interpret the evidence. Let's look at some life cycle events documented in the National Folklore Collection, and then we're going to move into case studies. We can learn more about traditional naming patterns within the family. And I think this is one that everybody knows. The eldest son is named after his paternal grandpa, the second son after his maternal grandpa, the third son named after his dad, if the name hasn't already been used. And the same pattern was used, but not as systematically for girl children, because names were linked to the inheritance of land. But we also learn, using the National Folklore Collection, about the specific circumstances in which that traditional naming pattern might actually be set to one side. Where the farm or the land was inherited by a daughter, known as a cleavon. Her husband was said to have married into the farm, And then the first boy is usually named after his maternal grandpa. Now my Scanlon great-grandfather married into my great-grandmother's Ryan family farm in Limerick. So now if I tell you that my great-grandmother was a Cleavon, you've got a clearer sense of what is meant. And now I understand why the eldest son was actually called after his mother's father. Interrupted. I looked at that for years and I wondered whether or not he was an earlier child that simply maybe had died young. A woman in childbirth was the responsibility of her mother or her married sister, of her birth family basically. Her husband's family would stand aside and they would let her birth family take over. And for this reason, the eldest child, sometimes the eldest 2 or 3 children in every family, was usually born and baptized in the mother's home place. A woman who gave birth shouldn't be left alone until she had been churched. And churching was a purification ritual that took place about a month after the child's birth, after the child was born. And according to folklore, women who died during this time, before they could be churched, couldn't enter heaven. So when a woman died in or shortly after childbirth, it used to be said that she'd been taken away by the good people. And a lot of those fairy traditions, we find them specifically around pregnancy, childbirth, and sometimes if a child is born with a disability. Marriages were celebrated in the bride's home parish. Traditionally, couples married at home or in their place of work, and this is during penal times. After the 1820s, we see a huge push by the Catholic Church to try and move people back into the churches. But there's a huge resistance. People love having the sacrament performed in their own homes. As late as the early 20th century, we still find some home marriages. And the collection also tells us about the straw boys who crashed the wedding party and claimed the right to dance with the bride. This photograph was taken in August 1964 in County Mayo. This is the same year that my parents got married. And we can learn about the bedding ceremony. And nowadays you only hear about the bedding ceremony if you watch Game of Thrones or similar, these kind of fantasy epics set in a fantastical, reimagined version of the medieval world. But the bedding ceremony was an ancient custom. It was practiced in Ireland and across all of Western Europe. We know it continued to be practiced in Ireland into the 19th century, and not least from the folk tune, the wedding of Sweet Beltray. It's said that we Irish do death well, and we find rich evidence about wakes in the National Folklore Collection. The community would gather in the house of the dead to keep the corpse company, to stand vigil. They commemorated the deceased person for 2 days and 2 nights before they were buried on the 3rd day. We find a lot of different types of wake games. There were games of strength and agility, like catch and hide and seek, lifting the corpse, and not the actual corpse. A living person would actually stand in, but the idea was that the young bucks had to be able to lift the person above their heads. And we find slapping games. I have 3 sons, and I can tell you that they continue this particular tradition to the present day. I mentioned already we find wrestling and bare-knuckle fighting taking place at wakes. There were also games that mocked the authorities. In Ireland, it was usually the landlord, the police, or the priest. Sending sinners to the bishop was a game that lampooned confession. The MC would call out the names of individuals and their misdeeds, and the sinner was then asked to perform a prank as a penance. Barging was another popular activity at wakes, and that survives down to the present day as the comedy roast. 2 men, sometimes 2 women, would duel verbally. They would make jokes at one another's expense. And the sharpest wit, the person who scored more points against their opponent, was declared the winner. And matchmaking games were very common at wakes. There were kissing games and mock marriages. A couple might be bundled into bed in a dark room, and the door locked behind them. They were left there for the entire night. In the 19th century, it was very common for matches to be made at wakes. So you can see why wakes maybe weren't popular with the local authorities. We can use the collection to explore what issues people were most concerned by. Bad weather is a big one. Heavy rain or drought might result in poor harvests and loss of livestock, leading to higher prices and food shortages. Loss of income could tip landless labourers and small farmers into a downward spiral of poverty. In a worst case scenario, rent arrears could lead to eviction. A family might have farmed in one place for generations, but a few bad years and they were turned out. They lost their home and they lost their livelihood. And I worked with Irish language poet Fiona Fitzsimon, and I think it's her great grandfather was the son of a family who were turned out on the side of the road in the 1890s. And that young man, the family continued to live in a little bender on the side of the road, so they remained homeless for at least 2 years. But that young man, because of the national school system, went on, got an education, and was elected an MP for his district in Kerry before 1922. People were worried about sudden illness or death. The collection has rich material on traditional folk medicine. I love this. We can learn about faith healers, herbalists, cures, and charms. I was looking at one recently. Meadowsweet was used for kidney diseases. And as a matter of fact, meadowsweet has an active ingredient which is used in penicillin. So sometimes there's actually real wisdom in the folk traditions. The other side of the coin was that people feared some diseases had supernatural causes. A rival or enemy, they thought, had somehow managed to harness magic or witchcraft to inflict harm on them. And we find a lot of stories like this in the folklore collection. Probably the most famous is the burning of Bridget Cleary in 1895. Ireland in the 18th and 19th century was heavily garrisoned and policed. The Irish people were very fearful of coming into conflict with the authorities. And interestingly, in the collection there are twice as many stories about landlords as there are about police. And in a sense that emphasises the importance of how dependent people were on maintaining good relations with their landlord, because that literally was their home, that was their living. Emigration is a key concern. Emigration separated families and accelerated the decline of traditional society that is documented in the folklore collection. And as Ireland modernised, people were concerned about the rapid pace of social change. Arguably the 1895 murder of Bridget Cleary by her husband was precisely because he couldn't tolerate some of those changes that made his wife financially independent of him. And let's look at some case studies. Researching the family history of President Michael D. Higgins with Dawn Heron, I found his paternal grandmother was twice baptized. Now, baptizing a second time is contrary to canon law. So what do you think the family were trying to do? Well, the family prevailed on the priest to baptize the child a second time. They were invoking the popular folk belief that baptism could bring on a sickly child. And the year it happened, 1851, is right on the cusp of the Notional Revolution. Now, incidentally, the president was delighted to hear about this, and he actually phoned me up later on and told me that his grandmother had a reputation of being a wise woman in her community. She was a woman who knew about the qualities of herbs and how to use of medicinal herbs and how to use them. She was a healer who knew the curative properties of herbs. Maureen O'Hara's paternal family are well documented. Now, O'Hara was her stage name. Her family name was, in fact, Fitzsimons, unfortunately no relation. The family were hereditary blacksmiths in Kells, County Meath, so going back at least 4 generations to the late 18th century. The Blacksmith's Forge was a public meeting place. It was an alternative to the pub. where men would gather to talk. In the National Folklore Collection, I found evidence of Maureen's grandpa, Bartholomew, 1853 to 1926, those were his dates. Barty Fitzsimons. Barty liked to talk politics. He was a supporter of Michael Davitt and the Land League. In 2016, I was commissioned by the Biden family to research the family history before their visit to Ireland in June that year. Now, Joe Biden identifies as Irish American. 5 of his 8 grandparents were born here on the island of Ireland. When he describes his immigrant ancestors arriving aboard coffin ships, he's absolutely on the money. They were all poor immigrants, escaping the famine, and like most people living in the margins, they don't leave much of a paper trail. But Joe Biden's ancestor, Carney, was a subtenant on a farm, Marinatraw, on the seashore on the Cooley Peninsula. And Marinatraw was a small holding, it's about 13 acres in total. The soil wasn't great for cultivation. But Carney's tenancy gave him the wreck of the sea, so anything that washed up on the beach. And he collected seaweed to fertilize his own land, but he also sold it on by the hundredweight to his neighbours. Now, when the landlord found out, he basically threw a tantrum because he wasn't getting a cut. He wasn't getting his share of the proceeds. This is Templetown Beach. Do you see the promontory ahead of me? That is this little hook. See the little hook up there on the left? That corresponds to that sharp hook of land where the Carneys had their farm. And so it was a perfect place to actually gather. It was a perfect part of the Cooley Peninsula where the greater part of the seaweed actually washes up. Interestingly, Marinatraw, it wasn't one of the place names that was adopted by the Ordnance Survey in 1837. So even when I found the family, I probably spent another 4 weeks trying to pin down exactly where it was. I lined up a whole load of documents to try and prove that Marinatraw was where I thought it was. And it was only as a last thought I returned to the Folklore Commission. Bingo. It was there. I could have saved myself an awful lot of work if I simply had gone there first. Okay, I am going to wrap up there, and I hope this talk has given you some ideas about how to use the National Folklore Collection in your research. We find stories of our ancestral places in the collection. It really does open a window into the past. We sometimes find evidence of direct or collateral ancestors. In the last century, tens of thousands of people were interviewed. A better knowledge of the customs and practices allows us to interpret just what exactly is going on when we find strange or unusual things in the sources, or strange words or terms. But I think above all, the National Folklore Collection allows us to interpret how people thought and acted and felt as they went through their daily business. And I'm going to finish with a quote from one of my favourite historians, Lindsay Erna Byrne. History is not sitting in a box, waiting for us to write it. History is what we construct out of the archives and the sources that we use. Hit some deadline there. So thank you very much.
No, I'd like to thank Fiona for that very interesting lecture. I'm sure most of us have looked at some parts of the Folklore Commission collection. Now, the only part I've really looked at would be the schools collection, which is interesting, but I'd say generally disappointing. A lot of material that is written in it is, I suppose, repetition of, very basic kinds of stories of the fairies and ghost stories and a few things like that. Now, occasionally you come across something interesting and something worthwhile, or occasionally what you'll find is the stories have a lot of local names in them as well, which is quite interesting. But another aspect, I suppose, of Fiona's talk there, which is important, is that very often you won't find photographs, or you won't find descriptions, or you won't find material about the lives of your own ancestors. But in genealogy, it's often important to use a kind of a parallel life. Now, I find it very useful in relation to my grandfather. Now, my grandfather was in the RIC, the Royal Irish Constabulary, and he had the full career there. He joined, I think, about 1900, and like all the members of the RIC, he got his marching orders in 1922. And when the Garda Síochána were set